So first up is Kelsey. Kelsey Borrowman has multiple graduate degrees from Stony Brook University and Villanova University. She's currently pursuing her PhD at Villanova, where she also teaches classes to undergraduate students, including Introduction to Philosophy and Philosophy of Disability. She works in critical phenomenology, pedagogy, and public philosophy, but largely focuses on the intersection of the history of philosophy and disability studies. Her work has been published in Concept and Interdisciplinary Journal of Graduate Studies and translated into Italian for a special issue on Michel Foucault. She's presented her work all over the United States as well as in Europe. She's currently working on her dissertation analyzing the role of health in the philosophies of Rousseau and Nietzsche. Kelsey lives in West Philly and is an avid gardener who tended one of the grave gardens at the Woodlands. Friends, please join me in welcoming Kelsey Borrowman.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've been part of the Woodland Grave Gardener since its formation. It's a lovely respite from the city life to have that garden there, and I always have dirt under my nails. So, well, first I want to thank Afroza and the entire organizing team at the PYM for putting together this keynote with Jonathan and me. And I want to thank all of you for inviting me into your community. The Quaker Friends are known for being a sympathetic and welcoming community that provide discernment and care, and for being advocates for all. In particular, in my experience, this includes a commitment to equality, justice, compassion, and the value of education. The community that I'm coming from is a community of philosophical inquiry. To be sure, in many cases, especially today, that means academia, though the particular type of philosophy that I'm interested in is one that often gets called public philosophy. And it ultimately is striving to be a discipline more in the sense of a way of life, not so much a department in the university, and aims to forge connections between other communities that share such commitments to education, friendship, and social justice. Values we'll be talking a lot about tonight. I find that the values that my community of inquiry strives for are quite resonant with those practiced in yours. And so once again, I'm so grateful to be here talking to you tonight. I would like to address some of the shared values that our communities have through a particular problem that is especially important to me in my work, namely disability and accessibility. So this talk is motivated by a set of interrelated questions. First, how do we offer a political education? That is, an education in what it means to be engaged with the world in a political sense. But by political, I don't mean politics. I mean it in the philosophical sense of polis, which literally means city, or more broadly can mean community. So when I say a political education, I mean an education geared toward a reflective engagement with the community and communities that we belong to. So to our city, literally or metaphorically conceived. Secondly, how do we create an accessible environment for learning for community and in general? And lastly, what values support the creation of that community? These questions are all linked by the assumption that access is a fundamental right that ought to be extended to all members of our communities, and that individual accommodations are more often than not a second best effort to address access. There's more we can do. How we construct our spaces, religious, educational, or otherwise, allows or disallows for certain kinds of thinking. But if we think flexibly and compassionately about disability accommodations and accessibility, it can open us up to seeing the ways that our institutions disadvantage those for whom access remains an issue. So this goes beyond the way we usually think of access. We usually connect access immediately to disability, but issues of inaccessibility affect so many of us, such as those who are caretakers, who work second jobs, who may be struggling with mental health as an effect of the incredible solitude and stress of the pandemic. Thinking about accessibility in this way, in a larger, broader sense, can enrich everyone's environment and invite different ways of thinking about what it means to think critically about our world together. So I want to begin by familiarizing us with some terminology, some debates, and the models within disability theory and communities. But this isn't just a matter of history, facts, and information. One of the points I'm going to be trying to make today is that how we conceive of and think about disability has real effects for the spaces and communities we cultivate. So this evening, we'll be trying to shift how we think. Then we'll return to what the stakes are for the philosophical community I think and act in, as exemplified by this polis, which we'll come back to too, and for the Quaker Friends and the values it seeks to enact in the world. So over the last 30 years or so, all over the world, disabled folks, activists, and allies have loudly proclaimed the historical and structural oppression and exclusion of disabled folks. One of the key elements of their critique has been to challenge over-medicalized and individualistic accounts of disability. So I want to talk about this model. It's called the medical model, which has been the dominant historical model for disability until very, very recently. And then we're going to look at another one called the social model. So one problem with these over-medicalized and individualistic accounts is that they frame disability as a medical problem, something that can and should be fixed via medical intervention. So to cure deafness with cochlear implants, for example, suggesting that anyone who's deaf feels a deficit and would absolutely unequivocally want to be fixed. So part of the problem here is the assumption of deficit. Actually, a great resource on deafness in particular is a YouTube video on Gallaudet University. You can find it if you search Gallaudet University, deaf architecture. And in it, a professor at the university suggests that instead of thinking about hearing loss, we ought to think about deafness as a gain in insight into the structure of the world, which this video examines via architecture. Another problem with the over-medicalized and individualistic accounts is that they assume that disability is a problem for a single individual and not connected to social or geographical environments. This would leave out the effects of, for example, inaccessible architecture, like not having a ramp or reading materials in Braille. In the social model, which we'll talk more about in a moment, what makes disability a problem is not being in a wheelchair or unable to climb several flights of stairs successively, but the building itself making a third floor, let's say classroom or meeting room, unreachable. And to be clear, this so-called medical model is not only held by medical professionals or practitioners. It's given the name because of how it frames disability as a medical model. So according to the medical model, disability is an individual or medical phenomenon that results from impairments in body functions or structures. It's a deficiency or abnormality and is bad as such. The way to intervene or the way to address the problem would be through fixing the disability to the greatest extent possible, or where that's not possible, normalization, or to appear non-disabled or to limit the perceptibility of one's disability. So the answer in this model is medical intervention. One instance in which we can see the medical model at work is in the stories of Stella Young, who describes herself as a comedian and journalist who happens to go about her day in a wheelchair. And Stella Young has a great TED Talk, which you can find on YouTube, entitled, "I'm Not Your Inspiration, Thank You Very Much." And I can't recommend it highly enough. In the video and elsewhere in her interviews and talks, Stella explains that when she was 15, someone approached her parents wanting to nominate her for a Community Achievement Award. Her parents, probably having a good sense of what was up, asked, "But what for?" As Stella puts it, she was a normal child. She fought with her brothers, hung out with her friends, and watched a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She had done nothing that could be perceived as an achievement aside from simply living with a disability. And this sort of thing happens to folks with disabilities a lot. She tells another story of being a substitute teacher, and a kid in the classroom stops her about 10 minutes into her lecture on legal studies and asks, "When are you going to start doing your speech? You know, your motivational speech?" So the problem here is twofold. First, we don't often see people with disabilities as our teachers, our doctors, our servers and waitresses. And secondly, when we do interact with them, especially in our early formative years, they're positioned as objects of inspiration. So Stella Young goes on in her talk to talk about the big lie about disability, that disability is a bad thing, capital B, capital T. And so to live with a disability makes you exceptional. And this is the assumption the community member made when they approached her parents. This is an outcome of the medical model of disability, and we can see it explicitly in other media. Oftentimes, people with disabilities have very stereotypical roles in films. They're depressed and hopeless, but through a friendship with an able-bodied person, the disabled person learns to embrace life. Or a disabled person shows a non-disabled characters how to be better people. It's the reverse of the first situation, but it follows the exact same logic. So let me show you a few examples. So you'll see these images that I'm about to show you float around social media routinely. The intentions are good usually, but they betray a certain way that we as a culture tend to view disability and disabled lives. In each of these examples, disabled people are exceptionalized and objectified for the sake of non-disabled people. The aim is to motivate able-bodied folks, to make us think, well, if they, a disabled person in this instance, can go on with their life and even accomplish extraordinary things, then I should be able to. Now, this is only a barely veiled way of saying that we don't expect disabled people to be able to accomplish anything, let alone anything extraordinary. You know, I don't have it as hard as that person does. I have no excuses. The assumption that undergirds all of these images and the emotions that they aim to make us feel is that disability is a bad thing. Again, the big lie about disability. The way that we represent people with disabilities matters, the way that we show up for them too. Culture makes and proliferates meaning. So these images really teach us to treat disability as an individual issue that's to be overcome by a medical intervention like prosthetics and a great attitude. This is a really popular one if you can't tell. So let me quote Stella Young on why the only disability in life is a bad attitude is so very wrong. She says, "It's just not true. No amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. Smiling at a television screen won't make closed captioning magically appear. And standing in the middle of a bookstore and radiating positive energy won't turn those books into Braille." So now back for a moment to the medical model of disability. The medical model positions disability as a personal problem best solved through strength of character and resolve. So the medical model ends up reducing the complex problems of disabled folks to issues of medical prevention, cure, or rehabilitation, and considers disability as a bad thing, something that should be fixed. As a result, and this is key, it is depoliticized. There's no space for discussions of rights or social justice, and it really forecloses the possibility of critiquing dangerous and hurtful able-bodied assumptions and discrimination. In terms of the values noted above, education, friendship, and social justice, the medical model limits our ability to understand the experience of disabled folks and ultimately to act as their friends, allies, and advocates. If the problem is located in the individual, then we as a community can only offer sympathy and support to individuals, which is important, but insufficient when it comes to addressing the social exclusion and the issues of access that many people with disabilities face. So we're looking for the kind of friendship that allows us to critically engage and inquire together into the conditions of well-being for the members of our community, but the medical model forecloses this as a possibility. I now want to turn to an alternative model that is more conducive to the values of our shared communities for thinking compassionately for outward society by taking care of one another. So the social model, as promised. The social model as an alternative refuses, firstly, the idea that disability is a physically determined fact. They actually make a split in their definition, which I'll read here in a moment. This is how the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation groups put it. In our view, it is society which disables physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments. By the way, we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. In this short statement from 1975, there is a re-envisioning of the very definition and meaning of disability. They make a distinction between disability and impairment. Impairment is the physical limitation that someone may face, a difference. Disability then is the social exclusion or oppression that someone with an impairment may face, where social exclusion would also include inaccessible architectures or environments, discrimination in employment or education. So impairment is private and unique to the individual, but disability is structural and public. And this distinction, even on its own, can completely shift the way we think about disability and accessibility. I mean, effectively, the social model says disability is a social construction, an externally imposed restriction. Yes, there is an impairment, a very real physical thing in many instances, but that impairment is not the problem. Your inaccessible classroom is, or your inability to cover mental health care under insurance is. So the social model asserts that disability exists in the interaction between an individual and their environment. So disability issues stem from someone with a disability trying to function in an inaccessible society. Let me give you an example of this disability versus impairment. Does anyone have contacts or wear glasses? I obviously do. Do you think of yourself as having a disability? Probably not. The truth of the matter is that those of us who do wear glasses or have contacts have a vision impairment that via technology and social normalcy is, well, not considered a disability. We don't think of it that way, and therefore, in a real way, it isn't one. It's not considered a disability because it doesn't exclude me from my world. It isn't a disability because I'm not treated differently than non-glasses and contacts folks. An impairment, yes, but not a disability. And an annoying impairment, I'll note, like sometimes I need to wipe my glasses in order to see sufficiently before a movie or driving or talking on Zoom. And there is a real cost, especially since, at least in my case, it's not covered under my insurance. On the other hand, I don't go into a job interview with my glasses on and worry that I'll be viewed as disabled and discriminated against because of it. So the point here is that impairments aren't disabling, but social and architectural barriers are. Perceptions can be disabling too. It's also a good example of the fact that even in the social model, medical interventions are welcome and helpful. The point here is simply that it is not the disabled body that needs to be cured, but society's ableism. And if the problems that produce oppression of disabled folks are rooted in social, political, architectural barriers, then we can do something about it. So instead of resorting to a can it be cured or must it be endured mentality, we can intervene in an effort to decrease environmental barriers and increase levels of understanding. You know, disability is no longer a personal issue or a problem to overcome with a good attitude, but now we have a collective responsibility for creating a more accessible world. Instead of seeing someone with a disability and being inspired by their perseverance, we can become emboldened to make changes to our environment so they don't have so much stuff to persevere against. Instead of seeing a disabled life as an accomplishment in itself, we realize that disability is not a bad thing. Inaccessibility and social exclusion are the bad guys. There are many strengths to the social model. First, it's politically effective. It has led to the ADA. It has led to so many social justice-based movements and getting rights for disabled folks. You know, it generates an understanding of disability where the moral responsibility is on society, not the individual, because it demonstrates that the problems disabled people face are the result of social oppression and exclusion, not individual deficits. Secondly, and this is a big one, by moving away from personal failure and deficit, you know, the social model laid the groundwork for a positive sense of collective identity for disabled folks. You know, it's not the disabled person who's to blame, but the attitude and barriers which disable her. She doesn't have to change, society does. And as a result, rather than feeling self-pity and shame, she can feel anger at the structures and systems that exclude her and pride in who she is. In the social model, the problem isn't in the minds and bodies of individuals, but built into our environments and social patterns, our habits, which exclude or stigmatize particular kinds of minds and bodies and ways of being. As Stella Young said, ableism looks like calling disabled people inspiring for navigating a system that is designed for their exclusion while doing nothing to hold that system accountable. So as a final word for now, the point is not to deny any real challenges that can greatly affect a person who might be physically, mentally, or otherwise impaired. However, when we focus too much on the deficits, or even the pain, the result is discrimination, prejudice, barriers to learning, and unequal rights to education, work, and the freedom to make one's life choices. So, but adopting an approach like the social model, or in doing so, the aim is giving accessibility, resources, choices, and to recognize, include, and embrace these needs in our community. As a collaborative whole community, everyone has a part to play in creating a more accessible world. I want to make a quick note about the terminology I'm using and the differences between person first and identity first language. Perhaps you noticed that I tend to vacillate between the two. Sometimes I say persons with disabilities or a person with autism, and other times I say an autistic person or disabled folks. Person first language puts the person before the disability in how they're framed. Using phrases like, again, person with a disability or person with autism. The focus here is on the person who's affected by the condition instead of the condition itself. You know, the first words you hear refer to the person as opposed to the disability that that person has. Now, identity first language uses phrases like diabetic person or disabled folks. Now, some people use identifiers because it can help those people to claim their disabilities with pride. People who refer to themselves using identity first terms may do so because they are celebrating or owning their disability instead of distancing themselves from their disability by adding on the phrase with a disability. So while persons with disability and other person first language was for a while considered the politically correct terminology, there's also an argument to be made that persons with disabilities or person first language overlooks the institutional discrimination and prejudice we're talking about with the social model. So in this view, persons with disabilities would be incorrect. People have impairments, they don't have disabilities. It can be taken as a denial of disabled identity, which a disabled identity that's really emerged since the disability rights movements began. There's no one answer here with regard to terminology. There isn't a single terminological preference across the disabled community because the disabled community, like all communities, is diverse, divergent in opinion and practice. And frankly, it has a lot to do with context. So let me say this just as a general rule. Follow the model being used by the disabled person themselves. How do they refer to themselves? Do they say, well, as a person with a disability, I've experienced such and such? Or do they say, as a narcoleptic, I experienced, et cetera, et cetera. But already being attentive to language says, I think this matters and I think you matter. So you're off to a good start. Disability is not an exception. 61 million adults in the US live with a disability. That's 26%, or 1 in 4 18 to 65-year-olds have some type of disability. Worldwide, the number is more than 1 billion. And in 2001, the worldwide number was 500 million. So it has doubled in 20 years. There are a lot of reasons for this. The fact that we're living longer is only part of the picture. The fact that we can now live longer because of medical interventions with disabilities and serious health problems is another factor. But there are also negative creations to this increase. Pollution, poverty, lack of access to healthcare, all of which create a really vicious cycle. This points even more clearly to the way that disability is not an exceptional issue. It affects all of us. Social justice for disabled folks is not just a matter of making the world a better place for disabled folks, which is a good aim on its own, but it is really for all of us. And this is my point regarding accessibility as well. Most accommodations are accommodations you would want for yourself. A good job with equal pay, more time, more understanding, access to resources and spaces for community, to participate in the society that you belong to. This is the notion of moving from like accommodations for one individual to accessibility for all. So to bring it back about the models here for a moment, different definitions of disability imply different possible actions and policies. And this is why the social model is preferable to the medical model. It puts the moral responsibility on the collective sense. There is something we can do about it if we think about disability in terms of the social model access to. What the social model allows us to see is that disability discrimination doesn't result from a bodily difference. It's about the world around us and the way the world is built, literally regarding buildings, but also our social world, our values and assumptions. And again, that means we can do something about it. So models foreclose or create possible actions. And we're looking for a model that allows for action in service of our community so that we can advocate for others through our commitments to equality, justice, and compassion. This means with the idea that if the world is built, again, literally in terms of architecture, but also in terms of our perceptions of disability and our social habits of exclusion, if it's built, then it can be rebuilt. As the keynote said on Wednesday, the world was designed, and we can repair our harmfully designed foundations of ableism and exclusion. Now, I don't want to give you the idea that the social model is perfect. There's a long scholarly and activist discussion that continues to critique and work through the best ways to approach these issues. However, it is one of the two large models. And for our purposes here, and going back to the values we've been talking about throughout, education, friendship, and social justice, the social model, unlike the medical model, allows us to model education as a desire, lifelong education, as a desire to change our view toward compassionate understanding and thinking together, and to turn it into a permanent process of self-evaluation and a critical, reflective inquiry with others. We can rebuild how we think, much like we can rebuild our spaces, to understand more deeply and recognize the power of diversity. Now, to begin to close, let me return to the philosophical stakes, that polis, the political education and community. For Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher, oh gosh, I didn't even write the date down. My undergraduate students are going to hammer me on this one. Luckily, I don't test them on that. If I can't remember it, they shouldn't have to. But Aristotle came after Plato, who came after Socrates, and that's sort of our lineage here. These are the founding figures of Western philosophy. So for Aristotle, the point of the polis, well, the polis exists for philia, 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 for political friendship. That's the point of the polis. That's the point of the city or the community existing. The criteria of whether or not you live in a legitimate polis is whether or not friendship exists. Now, Aristotle doesn't mean that everyone needs to be friends in the colloquial sense this time. But friendship in this context means something more like being committed to communal reflective inquiry, directed toward achieving the good life, actually much like the practice of Quaker Friends. He means that we are truly friends when we reflect and create a common good with one another. So if you live in a society where a fourth of the population can't get around or can't get jobs because they're excluded and discriminated against, then we don't have a legitimate, healthy, and well-functioning society. For a moment, let me take a broader example of what is called hostile architecture. This is when cities create public benches to discourage the ability to sleep on them, or put stakes on subway grates so someone can't sit there to warm themselves in winter. A true polis doesn't have exclusionary features like this. In a just state, citizens experience friendship with each other and that they wish each other well for their own sake and do things for each other even though they don't know each other well. So how do we get citizens that are capable of relating to each other in a politically friendly way? For Aristotle, it's education, the kind of education that the Friends offer in their schools. You know, the stakes of political friendship, doing something or affecting our communities, it's to produce a community where you don't aggressively segregate people on the basis of really arbitrary criteria. Now properly in closing. You know, one of the most fascinating features of philosophy of disability is that it engages with and reaches across the divide between the personal and the philosophical. Philosophy of disability often relies on, incorporates, and helps to make sense of living with a disability and interacting with disabled people in everyday life. To be clear, the discipline of philosophy is not immune from the same kinds of biases, prejudices, disrespect, and injustice that disadvantage disabled people in other areas of life. But philosophy of disability can also be a tool for social progress by clarifying and theorizing ideas that shape public policy and social goals in our community. There's a movement in philosophy called public philosophy that is attempting to break philosophy free from being completely bound to academic discourse. As important as that is, and as much as that is also my community, but public philosophy tries to recognize how philosophy ought to be a personally and spiritually transformative discipline. Again, discipline in the sense of a set of practices enacted in community with others. And this is where my intellectual community aligns so clearly and resolutely with the missions of Friends. By questioning underlying assumptions, we're aiming to reclaim and re-signify the notion of the life worth living and the stakes of communal responsibility, which is, to put it a little dramatically, the first and fundamental question of philosophy. The key question we need to ask ourselves as we unlearn what we think we know about disability is how our thinking and assumptions about life in general might be changed if we consider disability as a central, not exceptional, human experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. That was amazing. And we will all have to sit with that. There are some heavy stuff in there, but that was wonderful. Thank you so much. We are trying to keep to time, so we're going to move on, and I'm going to introduce our next keynote speaker. And that is Dr. Jonathan Luizar. Jonathan is a professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. His research and teaching centers around human-computer interaction with the focus on ICT accessibility for people with disabilities, user-centered design methods, assistive technologies, and law and public policy related to accessibility and HCI. Jonathan has authored or edited 14 books, including Research Methods in Human-Computer Interaction, Ensuring Digital Accessibility Through Process and Policy, Disability, Human Rights, and Information Technology, Universal Usability, Designing Computer Interfaces for Diverse User Population and Web Usability, a User-Centered Designed Approach. I could go on about all the 14 books he's written. He's also published over 150 articles in journals, conference proceedings, edited books, magazines, and have been granted 2 US pens for his works on accessible web-based security features for blind users. He frequently serves as an advisor to government agencies and regularly provides testimony at federal and state levels, and multiple US federal regulations cite his research for publications. Just this week, Jonathan was testifying before the Senate. He has been on the executive board of the Friends of the Maryland Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped since 2009. He has served as the co-chair of the Cambridge University Workshop on Universal Access and Assistive Technology since 2012, and has been on the program committee of the ACM Conference on Accessible Computing since 2006. He also serves on the executive committee from ACM, SIG-CHI. I don't know what this acronym stands for, Jonathan. You'll have to let us know, from 2010 to 2015. Dr. Luizar was the general chair of the ASITS 2021 conference, and he is the current director of the Trace Center and is a faculty member of the Human-Computer Interaction Lab. Friends, please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Hi there. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you. You missed mentioning I'm also a former resident of Philadelphia. So that.
No, I was totally going to do that. I'm so sorry, Jonathan.
That's also a really important thing. Let me pull up my slides here, and hopefully everyone can you see the slides, Rosa? Yes. Yes, are slides coming through now?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I want to start by telling you a little bit of my story, how I got involved with digital accessibility, and then tell you about the journey that you all will be taking as you try to make your technology more inclusive for people with disabilities. Now, often when I speak, people think, oh, a computer scientist or an information scientist. But really, I want you to start thinking about, if you want to build a more inclusive community, that actually means focusing on technology as part of that. So you often think, if I want to build an inclusive community, you think about your personal beliefs. where you think about how you interact with others, but maybe you don't think about computer science. And to make, in our digital world, especially we saw this during the COVID pandemic, if you want to build an inclusive community, it's really important to use inclusive technologies, because you want to make sure that everyone feels welcome. And that's really part of this. If your technologies are not inclusive and accessible, people won't feel welcome. They'll feel excluded. So some of what Kelsey was talking about with the physical spaces, same things occur with digital spaces and digital technologies and content. But I'm going to tell you how to start this journey. I want to start by talking a little bit about my journey into accessibility. I guess technically my first project involving accessibility is when my grandfather gave me a spray paint can, and the two of us spray painted a handicap parking space in the community where my grandfather and grandmother lived. Maybe that wasn't really an accessibility project. Maybe that was more civil disobedience. But it, you give a 9-year-old a spray paint can and say, we're going to make something more accessible, and that really sets someone on a certain path. But that's parking accessibility, and we'll talk about digital accessibility. So in terms of digital accessibility, where does my journey start? It actually started when I was at Loyola University, Maryland. It used to be Loyola College when I was there, but at Loyola University, Maryland. And I started as an economics major. And this is great. I get to include a picture of me much younger with much more hair, and it's also darker. So here's a picture of me as an economics major. And, I started because I was really interested in behavioral economics. I'm interested in the decisions that people make and why they make those decisions, right? And I thought I was going to change the world using behavioral economics. Then I took sophomore year economics, and the professor taught us all about how the bubonic plague was economically a good thing. And I said, wait, but the plague, the bubonic plague, right? Millions of people suffer and die. And the professor said, well, the supply curve shifts to the left, meaning a higher equilibrium price. And I said, well, wait a minute, but supply curve shifting to the left means millions of people suffer and die. He said, but the important thing economically is that there was a higher equilibrium price for labor. And the epiphany I'm having as a sophomore in college is, but plagues are bad. There is no reason why we want to say plagues are good, right? And the professor was adamant that economically speaking, plagues were good. And I remember meeting with him and saying, you know what? I have to find a new major. I don't know what it is. It's not economics, right? Millions of people suffer and die, and plagues are bad. I want to find something where I can help the world. I want to find something where I can make the world a better place. This was actually the final exam question from that course. Oddly, there was a silver lining in the cloud that was the Black Death, right? And we had to explain all these things. And I said, this isn't for me. And at the time, I was talking with my professor of management information systems, Meg Richards, and I was telling her that I have to find a new major. I don't, economics isn't for me. Plagues are bad. This for me was, just plagues are bad. And, at the time, she said, well, there's this research lab at the University of Maryland. It's called the Human Computer Interaction Lab. You should come down. Maybe you'll try it, right? Maybe you'll like it. And, I said, okay, I'd never heard of human computer interaction before. And I came down to the open house at the University of Maryland, because at the time I was a Loyola student. And there I heard Ben Schneiderman, who was really the founder of the field of human computer interaction. You see him then and now. And he was at this symposium talking about how we're going to use technology as a force for good. And we're going to make sure that grandparents can email their grandchildren. And we're going to catch medical errors, and we're going to improve the quality of life for people, and we're going to make the world a more inclusive place using technology. Technology is a force for good. I was hooked. Years later now, I'm a professor at the University of Maryland and a faculty member in the Human Computer Interaction Lab. But it was a message about social justice and helping society and using technology for good. And that's how I got into accessibility. People often think you go into technology because you like technology. I actually got into it because I thought plagues were bad, and I wanted to find a way to do something good in the world and improve the world. And it was Ben Schneiderman's talk about how technology is a force for good that really got me interested in this. And so I tend to think of it very much, technology, from a social justice and a spiritual point of view. So that's my journey into accessibility. But I want to make sure that you all understand that accessibility is a journey. It's not that you're going to be able to say, okay, tomorrow we're going to make everything accessible. It takes time. Your communities need to learn more about accessibility. You need to evaluate what you've done to find out if there are barriers that exist. So accessibility, digital accessibility, is a personal journey, and it takes time. It takes planning, and it takes reflection, because you need to understand why you're doing it. You need to understand what it will take, what barriers already exist, and then you have to plan out, because many of them may take a few months. It may take you learning some additional details about digital accessibility. So I'm going to structure this talk into 4 parts. First, what do we mean by digital accessibility? Then second, what are the types of digital content and applications? Third, where do we start? I'm going to give you, if you say tomorrow, I'm convinced I want to start, can you give me some things to start with checking? I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to give you sort of a broader list of what you want to learn about. So what does it mean, digital accessibility? It means that someone with a disability, and thank you again, Kelsey, for that fantastic presentation, including discussing all aspects of terminology. So like Kelsey, I'll be switching back and forth in terminology. A person with a disability, if we talk about something being accessible, a technology, it means that a person with a disability can get the same information and engage in the same transactions as a person without a disability, with a substantially equivalent ease of use. And that's an important part, because imagine you had someone who's a wheelchair user, and they say they're told that the building is accessible, but they can't go on the front door. They have to go on the back door, because there's a ramp in the back door, and then they have to take a freight elevator going up 3 floors. And then they have to get off at that floor and take another freight elevator going up 3 floors to get to where they want to. That's not equivalent ease of use. If you have to use a lot of workarounds, if it takes much more time, it's not equivalent. It's not equivalent ease of use. And when we talk about this, about designing for digital accessibility, it encompasses a lot of different things. For many people with disabilities, they may use an alternate input or output approach. And by the way, that's not just people with disabilities. Think about it, right? You may dictate something to your car, or you may listen. You may listen while you're driving, right? So everyone uses these alternate input and output approaches, right? So people with disabilities, for instance, if you're blind, you may use a screen reader. That's audio output to hear what appears on the screen if you can't see it. That's if you have no residual vision. If you're low vision, right, you may use magnification. If you're deaf or hard of hearing, you may use captioning on video. You may have a repetitive strain injury, and you may not be able to use a pointing device, or you may use your own pointing device. So the key is that you want to make web content, applications, documents flexible so that they will work for people with all these different input and output approaches. And not everyone with a disability uses an alternate input or output approach. Some people use what's already built into the operating system, like autocorrect, right, and word prediction. But when we talk about digital accessibility, what we're talking about is flexibility. It's flexibility. Now, people with disabilities need to have the right tools that they use. So like someone who's blind, right, they may use a screen reader, or they may use magnification if they're low vision. Or again, someone with a repetitive strain injury may use an ergonomic keyboard that's split in half. We don't often think of repetitive strain injuries as disabilities, but the reality is just different input approach. So the user with the disability needs to have the right tool for their needs. That's not your concern generally as a community. Your concern is to make sure that your websites and documents and all these other things are flexible enough so that regardless of what type of assistive technology an individual uses, it's flexible so that the user has the right tool, and you've made your website flexible enough so that it'll work, regardless of whether they need to listen to a web page or whether they need to watch a video but they can't hear the video. You want to make sure you add that flexibility in. So that's when accessibility happens, when the user has the right tool and when you build content and systems and applications that are flexible. Now, when we talk about disabilities, Kelsey talked about the broad range of disabilities, and certainly the legal definitions of disabilities are very broad. But when we talk about it in a computing term, we're generally talking about it in terms of how it would change the input or output. So there are a number of disabilities, for instance, that are legally disabilities, but they wouldn't change the input or output. So for instance, if you're gluten intolerant, if you have diabetes, if you have AIDS, these are disabilities within the Americans with Disabilities Act, but they don't change how you interact with the computer. So typically we're talking about people who have perceptual disabilities. So again, blind, low vision, deaf. Capital D deaf means use of sign language, or hard of hearing. Hard of hearing, usually someone who just can't hear but is not a sign language user. People with cognitive or intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome, autism, dyslexia, traumatic brain injury. And people with limited use of speech. Maybe they're unable to speak. Maybe they have limited use of hands or limited use of fingers, or they have a repetitive strain or spinal cord injury. So typically in computing, we talk about these as the three major categories. However, you don't have to go in and design for each one. You don't go in and put in a feature for blind users and a feature for these users. You actually use a set of technical standards and use tools, and those cover almost all of these disabilities. So you only have to design once and it covers a majority of these disabilities. So again, accessibility is flexible and innovative. Accessibility is innovation. It means you're creating new innovative ways of doing things, and accessibility helps everyone. It's not just people with disabilities. Accessibility actually helps everyone. And creating accessible content is just good coding, right? It doesn't change how it appears on the screen. If someone says, oh, it's text only to make it accessible, that's not true, right? But what accessibility does is it makes things flexible in a way that everyone can appreciate. There was recently an article in the Washington Post, and I love this article. The unexpected star of NASA's web images, the alt text descriptions. And so they had these stunning photos that they put online, and these stunning photos, because their photos might not be accessible to people who are blind, so they come up with what's known as alt text, alternative text. And here's an example of the alternative text. The image is divided horizontally by an undulating line between a cloudscape, forming a nebula along the bottom portion and a comparatively clear upper portion. Speckled across both portions is a star field, showing innumerable stars of many sizes. The smallest of these are small, distant, and faint points of light. Isn't that beautiful? That's beautiful. Right? What did the Washington Post say? This alt text is so popular, people with and without disabilities. The Washington Post said that description can be appreciated by anyone, by someone who is blind, or someone who wants to know more about astronomy, or anyone who appreciates the care that goes into choosing just the right word. People who want to learn about astronomy can learn from that description. And it's just beautiful text. It's almost like poetry. That's a perfect example, and in the Washington Post, of how accessibility helps all users. Now, think similarly of captioning on video. Captioning on video was originally designed for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but we use captioning in many different ways. We use captioning in noisy places. We use captioning in quiet places. We use captioning in airports. English language learners use captioning. People who have learning disabilities use captioning. Captioning helps everyone. Captioning of videos helps everyone. So that was a basic overview of digital accessibility. Next, I want to talk about what types of digital content and apps. So, because you might say, well, this sounds great, but I don't know that my community uses the types of technology. If you have a website, guess what? Your website needs to be accessible. Do you send out over email, MS Word documents? You want to make sure those are accessible. PowerPoint files, PDF documents, registration forms. If you procure any software applications, right, those need to be accessible. If you put videos on YouTube or somewhere else, those need to be accessible. So probably in your community, you have some technologies that you need to check to make sure that they're accessible, and you may need to fix them. Now, ideally, we want to get to the point that technologies are born accessible, but you have to start with looking at what you have and figuring out how can you start that journey towards accessibility. It's really important because when communities strive to be inclusive, right, they make sure that people with disabilities get the same content at the same time. So to say I'm going to, post this, and then the person with the disability has to complain and they have to say, can you remediate this? And then there'll be a delay. There's something disrespectful about making people beg to please remediate this for me, please make it accessible, right? But the idea is that if it's not accessible, there's also a time delay, right? So not only is it unfair to have people ask and require it, but they may not get the information for a week. And the value of information may drop over time as well. So, if you send out information about a meeting and it's not accessible, the person may miss the meeting. And just saying, oh, I'll call you and tell you and I'll summarize what it says, that's not appropriate either. You need to make sure that people with disabilities get the same content at the same time. And that's the respectful and inclusive way to do it. So where do we start? Now, let's talk about some places to start. Let's say you've reflected, you say this is important, I want to start. What are some easy ways? What are some easy ways that I can start now on learning what is and what is not accessible from our community and what we can do? I'm going to give you 3 easy examples. First of all, if you're sending out Word documents, make sure that all the pictures in your MS Word document include alternative text known as alt text. You saw that with the Washington Post example. So here's an example of how you would do that. In Microsoft Word, you have a picture, right? You right-click on the picture in Microsoft Word, and you go, when you right-click to where it says edit alt text, and then you type in the alt text about, in this case, people at a booth at the trade show. It's that easy. It's that easy, right? Right-click on the picture, select from the pop-up list, edit alt text, and write in the alt text. That's one example. Now, with your videos, make sure that if you have videos that they have accurate closed captioning. Now, what do I mean? Well, really, you should professionally get all of your videos captioned, where it's done by a human captioner to make sure that the wording is accurate and correct. But you may not be at that point yet. And something really great to do, YouTube has automated captioning. And at the beginning, it was really poor quality. It's slowly getting better. So here's what I would suggest. Any videos that you've posted from your community, turn on the closed captioning. In YouTube, you can do that in the button in the lower right-hand corner, right? And then watch the closed captioning and see if it is accurate. See if it's accurate, right? Now, I actually picked this video from CBS this morning. It was a video about how the Philly food scene goes way beyond cheesesteaks. And I picked this one moment right here because the chef said, Philadelphia is the best sandwich city in the country, right? As a former Philadelphian, at least for a little while, I thought that would be a fun video to include. Check to see if your videos have accurate captioning. If the captioning is not accurate, go into YouTube and edit the captioning to make it accurate. If it's something really simple and short, if it's something more complex, hire professional captioners. But right now, the AI captioning may be okay, depending on your needs and how short the video is. And if your video has, relatively simple things in it. So, but check and find out how are our videos in terms of the automated captioning. A third thing you can do, make sure that your web pages are designed for accessibility. Some easy things you can do when you have hyperlinks in your web page, write useful hyperlinks. Don't have click here for more information, click here, because if you're blind and you're listening to the web page, all they will hear, all the blind users will hear is click here, click here, click here. Have descriptive hypertext link. And if you have tables, only use them for data. Don't use them for like lists. Don't use them for layout. And have good color contrast. You see in this example here, I have red text on blue, that's not good, right? Green text on blue, that's not good. Light gray on light blue. These are simple things that you can check. When you say, I want to get started, I'm excited about accessibility, you can start with these simple steps. And then once you've gotten a little bit comfortable with it, then you should learn more about accessibility. And the starting point for your learning about digital accessibility should be the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? You sometimes hear people refer them as WCAG or WCAG. This is the International Technical Standard for Creating Accessible Interfaces. It is the most well-accepted, well-documented set of technical guidelines for accessibility in the world. And it's not only for websites. You can use the WCAG concepts, the Web Content Accessibility concepts. You can use them to apply to all these other things as well, other types of interfaces. The current version is 2.1. And I'll tell you, if you say, I want to learn more about this, but I'm not sure I really understand technical details, guess what? There are multiple videos. There are many videos online that you can watch on YouTube about digital accessibility and WCAG and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? There's even a music video. So if you say, I could learn by watching a music video, search on YouTube, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG music video, or WCAG theme song. Don't do it right now. Wait till after we've had a chance to finish the presentation and the Q&A. But it's a really fun video. And if you go to the Web Accessibility Initiative website, they have a lot of links as well to great instructional videos. They have a lot of great resources. So according to WCAG, websites should be four things. There are four theories with websites. First of all, perceivable. So regardless of what type of disability you have, you want to make sure that the users can perceive the interface. So like if you're blind, you should be able to listen to the interface. If you're deaf, you should be able to see the captioning on the screen, right? So present information in ways that users can perceive. Operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable. So that means that depending on what you use for input, maybe you use a keyboard, maybe you can't use a keyboard and you use speech recognition, maybe you can't use a pointing device. You want to make sure that the interfaces are operable regardless of what types of input devices people use. Understandable. You want to make sure that web pages and content is structured in a clear way, a logical, as I said, don't use a table to explain, don't use a table for layout, use a table for tabular data. If you have an ordered list of items, don't use a table, use an ordered list. So make sure that the text is clear, make sure that the instructions are clear and it's organized and structured and nested properly, and then make sure it's robust so people can use it regardless of what types of user agents they have, what types of assistive technologies they have, and also current and future. So it can be interpreted by a wide variety of browsers and assistive technologies. P-O-U-R, like you're pouring a beverage, P-O-U-R, pour. Those are the core concepts of digital accessibility with the WCAG. Now, some of the examples that they give you, and there's, by the way, WCAG, they have kind of like a small, medium, and large version. So if you remember like Cliff Notes from many years ago, when people didn't want to read the book, they read Cliff Notes. They have like a Cliff Notes version called the Quick Ref. And many of the things in WCAG are things we already talked about. Alternative text on graphics, right? Making sure you have a web page that doesn't flash, because a flashing web page could cause someone to have a seizure depending on the type of flashing. As I mentioned, content that you can access even if you can't use a pointing device. Tables and forms. So if you're listening to a web page and you want to tab through the different tables, right? Or let's say the different form fields, don't have field 1, field 2, field 3. Name them like last name, first name, street address. There's an example in my county in Maryland where it used to be that the form to sign up for emergency alerts from County Emergency Alert, it wasn't an accessible form. It would say like field 1, field 2, field 3. And of course, make sure that all videos have captioning. So those are just some of the guidelines for WCAG. But you're not alone if you say, I want to learn about this, but maybe I need some help. Keep in mind, most of the content generation tools that you have accessibility tools built in. So like Microsoft Word has an accessibility checker. PowerPoint has an accessibility checker. You can select the accessibility checker and it will tell you where you've succeeded and where you failed. And usually if you haven't planned for accessibility or you weren't aware, it's probably not going to be accessible. The graphic you see on the left side is the accessibility checker in Adobe Acrobat. Most web content most web content management systems also have web accessibility testing tools. So look for the existing accessibility checkers in whatever tool you're using for content. They will help guide you through the process. They already exist, you already have them, you've already paid for them. And by the way, if you have, for instance, an iOS device, right, you probably already have, for instance, if you have an iPhone, if you have a MacBook, right, you already have a screen reader called VoiceOver built in. You don't have to buy it. If you wanna, if you wanna test out a website, but be careful, people often who aren't familiar with screen readers, right, they have misperceptions of how they work and they misunderstand what's accessible and what's not. So I would say start with these accessibility checker tools rather than starting with, I'm gonna go inspect it with a screen reader. I wouldn't do that first. Now, anytime that your community is purchasing anything for the community, software, web apps, applications, ask the vendor if it's accessible. Now, if they say, what does that mean? Don't buy it from them. Ask them for their voluntary product accessibility template, a VPAT. If they say, what's that? Don't buy from them, right? The key thing is if you're spending your money, we often think of how we spend our money is a way to share our values, to implement our values. And so what you want to do is make sure if you're spending money on software, apps, any of these things, what you want to do is make sure that you are spending on only accessible technologies. We read some web reviews of the software, contact a disability rights group in your area, right? And that partner with them. But ask the vendors. That's usually a first check. And the vendor says, what are you talking about? That's not a good sign. Now, from just a respectful point of view, involve people with disabilities in the process, right? Don't just say, we want to make it more accessible. Involve people with disabilities. Have a technology advisory committee, which includes people with disabilities. Have a committee that helps guide your technology decisions and your content and your purchasing of technology. So involve people, right, into the community, make everyone feel welcome. Partner with disability rights groups in your local community. They're generally eager to help and eager to advise. Realize, as I mentioned, that there are sometimes misperceptions of how people with disabilities utilize technology. Don't assume you have a good understanding of, for instance, how a blind person will listen to a web page, because many blind people, more advanced users, they don't listen to the web page and sit there passively. What do? They actively keyword search, or they go through headers, or they go through links lists. They have active approaches. And if you hear a company saying, well, do this, this will simulate being someone who's blind, or use this overlay, it's AI based and it'll solve all your problems, it probably won't. The best thing to do is involve people with disabilities into the process. That's the most respectful, inclusive thing to do, to build a community of care, to build a community where everyone feels welcome, to build a community where technology is not a barrier. Accessibility is a journey. It will take time. Start thinking about it now. Start examining where your community may have succeeded and may not have succeeded in the past, right? And think about what are things that we can do to make our community more inclusive. How can we bring people into the discussion? How can we remove barriers? It may take months, it may take a year or two to get all of your things accessible for all the different types of communities. The journey starts now. Thank you again for this opportunity to discuss digital accessibility. I look forward to your questions and to your great insights, and it is a pleasure and an honor to spend time with you this evening as you move on the holy path of making a more inclusive community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was incredibly informative and fun, and we got to see a photo of you when you were in college.
There you go.
Great keynote. I'm going to now open up for questions. So if you have questions, please raise your electronic hands and I will call on you and you can ask Jonathan or Kelsey whatever question that it is you have for them. If you're unable to ask the question, please put it in a chat directly to the staff and we will get to it. Joan, do you have a question?
It's a little more than a question. This is for Jonathan. Our wonderful clerk of our meeting is blind. She knows Braille. She's an amazing person. And she has so much trouble with all the technology for blind that's supposed to work. And just wonder if you have an advice about maybe some company or some place where she might get some better information. She has an iPhone. She has so much trouble using it. That sort of thing.
Thank you. It's Joan. Thank you so much for your question. Let me just make sure I'm understanding this. You're saying that the individual who is blind has trouble not with accessing your content or with the tools you buy, but using her own assistive technology?
Yeah, she has technology that is supposed to work.
Okay. Okay, great.
In Word and on her phone.
Okay, fantastic. So assuming that it is the source of the problems are her tools and not your content, there are a few different sources I would check. First of all, and in terms of the Philadelphia area, every state and has these same type of resources. This applies to anyone, but there are a few different resources typically that I suggest. First of all, I believe in Philadelphia, it's at Temple University. There's a technology assistance program that every state has, and it's known as an Assistive Tech Act program. Perhaps, by the way, when a question comes for Kelsey, I can do some quick searching and seeing if I can find it. But I believe it's at Temple University. It's called the Assistive Tech Act program. Maybe Afroza can also do some quick Googling. And so that is a program that every state offers. You've already paid for it with your tax dollars. And what it does is they lend out devices, right, to people to try out different assistive technology devices. Think of it as a lending library for assistive technology. They don't sell anything. They don't charge anything. You already paid for it with your tax dollars. The idea is that, assistive technologies can be expensive. And so rather than buy something, so I would say, don't go to the companies first because they want to sell you something. Go first to your government resources because they want to help you figure out what the right match is. So that's one, the Assistive Tech Act program, which I believe, again, is at Temple. Second of all, every state has a library for the blind and print disabled, right? And so trying to remember, I believe there's a branch in Philadelphia. All right, there's a branch in Philadelphia. Yes, okay. So they sometimes have free training classes, right? And they sometimes will lend out technologies, and also that person in your community also certainly would qualify for those services. So I would check with them. Third of all, if she doesn't have basic training on assistive technology, there are a number of advocacy groups that can point you to the right types of training. So typically there is what's known as blindness adjustment training. So if you're starting to lose your vision or you grow up without vision, they put you what's known as training where you can get a series of skills. That's where you learn like Braille, cane skills. It sounds like she already has had the training. Perhaps though she could go back and get some training on the Assistive Tech Act, on the Assistive Tech part, if indeed that's the problem. Sometimes it's hard to determine from outsiders if the problem is someone's use of their own technology. I like Kelsey's example of having a good attitude won't make the stairs turn into a ramp, I think was Kelsey's term. Well, having a great attitude and the right assistive technology won't make an inaccessible website usable for you. So it's important to discern the difference between those two. So Kelsey, thank you for all those great examples. But I'm more than happy, Joan, you have my email. If there are more questions, you can follow up with me over email.
I see a couple of hands. Olivia, do you want to go first?
I have a question in the chat for Kelsey. And this is from Tina Stanton. Can you speak about invisible disabilities like aphasia or chronic fatigue or weaknesses?
Absolutely. Yes, and at great lengths, if you'll allow me. So I'll try. If there's something more that is more specific you would like me to say, feel free to throw that in the chat as well. And I'm sure Olivia can pass it on to me. But this is one of the reasons why broadening our understanding of disability beyond our really kind of stereotypical markers is so important. I don't remember the statistic of how many people have invisible or non-visible disabilities. Now, some of these were the ones that Jonathan mentioned that don't necessarily, or Jonathan mentioned it and mentioned a few in the context of thinking about disability for usability of websites, but these could be diabetes, Crohn's disease, autism as well, and other severe illnesses, which may be either temporary or have long-lasting effects. And one of the effects of the social model in creating a new way of seeing disability has been to make a collective of folks, again, so diverse, including the non-visible and invisibly disabled folks, in order to advocate for themselves, because oftentimes they actually face increased misunderstanding because people say, you look fine, you look healthy, you look able-bodied. And so in addition to facing issues of access, they have to like prove their disability, which is an injustice in itself. I hope that, yeah, if that was specific enough.
Oh, thank you, Kelsey. That was informative. I have a question in the chat from Sam Connell. She asks, I'm curious if creating web content that is adaptive for mobile devices can also help make the content accessible for assistive devices. I believe this question is for Jonathan.
Yep. Afroza, I just gave you the link to the Tech Owl program at Temple, and I was in the process of finding the library ones. Okay. So actually, I'd like to flip your question. If you make it usable for a mobile device, does that make it accessible? So not necessarily, but one problem that sometimes occurs is that people will say, well, just use our mobile version. The mobile version is more accessible, but usually the mobile version doesn't have all the equivalent information and functionality as the full version. So instead, what I'd like to say is, if you make it more accessible, will that make it work better on a mobile device? And the answer to that is yes. So, because typically what you're doing by making it accessible is you're making it flexible. That will help on a mobile device. But don't say, if I make it work for a mobile device, will that make it more accessible? Because often then what happens is you may wind up in a situation where you actually have less functionality and people with disabilities are not getting an equivalent experience.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Michael, you have your hand raised.
Hi, yes, I have a question for Jonathan and I have a question for Kelsey. My question for Jonathan is, do you still think plagues are bad? And the reason why I asked
I didn't, wait, say that again. I didn't hear what you said. You said do something bad, and I didn't hear what the word was.
Do you think plagues are still bad? And the reason why I asked this is because COVID has taught us new ways of worshiping, new ways of connecting. It's had a lot of downfalls, absolutely, but it has taught us new ways to be. So I just wanted to know if you still felt that way, because you threw that in there. So I thought you probably have changed your opinion a little bit. Is that correct?
You know what? I still think they're bad, because what happens is that people suffer and die.
That is true.
And there are all of these issues about, we don't often care about all these people who are suffering and dying. Why don't we? What anyway? So, but that's really more a philosophical, spiritual question. Let me tell you though, accessibility problems that have happened during the pandemic. And so what happened was, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, right, there were a lot of, and I did some research on this and did interviews, a lot of universities and schools. What they said is, oh my God, we have to figure out how to get all of these things online immediately. And the years of progress that we've made on getting, for instance, procurement controls in place, where you can't spend like a state dollar, you can't spend a federal dollar without first making sure that what you're procuring is accessible, right? Like state universities, they just toss that right out, right? They're like, oh, emergency authorization, fast track authorization, we can buy whatever we want. We don't have to check for accessibility. So I did a series of interviews. There's an article online about this. And I mean, one of the examples of bad things is that someone I interviewed said they had staff, someone who managed digital accessibility said they had staff at their university who said, oh yeah, we got to bypass all of those accessibility things and even the security requirements. We bypass those too. I need this software today. I order it today. And we're going to be suffering for years with all of these new technologies that were procured without all of the testing that we normally do and the procurement controls. Look, I don't want any of my money as a taxpayer, whether a Maryland taxpayer, a former Pennsylvania, right? Federal, I don't want any of my money spent building barriers that stop people with disabilities from fully taking part in the world of employment, the world of education. So actually, it actually set us back in terms of accessibility, the pandemic, because we have so many technologies that basically bypass all the safeguards we've been putting in place, and we're going to be stuck with those for years, right? And this idea that you can just fast track authority and bypass all the controls as if people didn't matter. Oh, good. There's a crisis. I get to skip all these things you normally make me do. No. What about the humanity? What about the inclusion of people? So that's actually, I will find the link. When the next question goes to Kelsey, I'll try to find the link to that article, and that way you can share more about that, that study of all the people I interviewed who manage digital accessibility.
Well, that's very good. And just to let you know, I mean, I'm a non-driver, so I'm able to connect. I'm a member of the Lehigh Valley monthly meeting. I live in Stroudsburg. So I mean, this technology has enabled me to become a member, to join, to reconnect.
Strasburg, Pennsylvania, you mean? Strasburg, like with the trains? And
Stroudsburg. Yeah, no.
Stroudsburg. Sorry, I thought I said Strasburg with the trains.
No, we're up
one of my favorite childhood memories.
Oh, no, we're up in the Poconos.
The Poconos, got it. Stroudsburg. Sorry, misheard you.
Yes, that's okay. No. Now, my question for Kelsey, I work in behavioral health. A lot of what you said about inclusiveness, you know, I get along sometimes much better with the patients than I do with the staff. Staff has their drama. Patients are, you know, they see me. I share with them I'm a behavioral health consumer, and so is my spouse. So I let them know right then and there that I connect with you. I try to remember their names. Even when I first started in behavioral health, I try to remember their names before even coworkers. I mean, only because I really want them to understand that I want to decrease the stigma. But my question is, I'm trying to work myself around this. There are some people that are not going to get better. I mean, some people that we regulate their meds, we send them back out into the world, and they're great as long as they stay on their medication. That's fine, and that's what I kind of share with them about that. But there are people that, you know, we've had patients that they're grandiose, their thoughts are just really out there, but they're nice people, and you know, you can have good conversations with them. They're not scary people. They're friendly people. I just don't know how to make society see them as valuable. That's the problem I face. I see them as valuable. They're very, everybody that comes into that department, they're highly intelligent. There's a fine line between insanity and brilliance. So I guess my question is, how do we end the stigma for people that have really strong behavioral health, personality disorders, things like that, that are no danger to society, but society won't accept them because they see them as crazy.
God, I mean, I wish I had like a really succinct little package that we could just unwrap together and solve this problem. So first, I want to tag on to what you said about accessibility during the pandemic as well. Well, first of all, Jonathan, I had no idea. So I didn't realize how, like, the ways in which we were set back. But like Michael, I was able to connect to new communities. And I saw other professors and teachers thinking about accessibility because they had to for the first time. So I do see the benefits, but of course, and I think the way to destigmatize folks with behavioral health issues, especially as you're saying, the really exceptional cases, is to, in part, do as you're doing for them, which is to say, I see you. I know that you're smart and I am here with you, right? Like, I see you and I value you. The feedback loop that starts, I just think can't be measured, and strikes me as incredibly valuable. But also being who you are in front of other people who might have stigmatized it. So doing the work that you do and talking about the work that you do with other people, it's like, it's a little trickle, right? Like, to fully solve this problem, I hope education is one route to do that, and education in formal and in informal senses, including this one, right, in order to talk about these issues. I also think it's visibility. As a society, we tend to put people in dark corners and pockets and behind walls and historically in institutions. And I think bringing people in as part of the conversation, seeing them and saying hello to them when you know them, I mean, I think that is a huge step forward. And for me, those are the little progresses I think about because they're the ones I can affect, especially directly in my community where we have people. You know, I know them, I see them, and I just try to communicate that when I see them. God, if there really was a button I could push, though, you know. But I think this is where brainstorming among people who are working in institutions with Congress, you know, like, we all have to come together to think about these things because we have a tendency to stay in our boxes of interest and care. And I think spreading that care out and having conversation is at least the first step.
I agree, and I appreciate that. I have tears in my eyes because, you know, it's really it's important to me. There, I mean, like, I've reached people that are sometimes very difficult to reach. Oddly enough, so I see some of my former coworkers here from yearly meeting, like Joan and Rita, things like that. But I dress in plain dress when I'm at work. I still do that when I'm at work in the hospital. So people have come up to me and they say, "I know you're what is it about you?" You know, and I tell them I'm Quaker. I dress plainly. Also, it's convenient and it's easy. I didn't inherit a fashion sense. So, but the fact that they know me me and they see me, is just incredible. And I had one girl that like, she had an outburst and she pushed me, she's schizophrenic and delusional. She came along later on after she was doing like mad pacing around, and she hugged me and said, "Michael, you're the only person that treats me so nice. I'm so sorry." And it's just, and it's true, when I can reach her, when I can get through and get her not talking to the voices, she shares with me stuff that's pretty brilliant and pretty intelligent. So anyway, I digress, but thank you for that. I do value them, and I do, try to get through to them individually.
Thank you, Michael. We have time for 2 more questions. Ashanta has her hand raised, and Elder Ed has asked a question in the chat. And after Ashanta goes, I will ask that question. Ashanta, go ahead.
Thank you, Afroza. This question is for Jonathan. You mentioned in ways that an organization can ask those with disabilities to assist them in their accessibility process or improving their accessibility. I would like to know, do you have an effective way of asking someone with a disability how to assist an organization without that person feeling like pointed out or exposed, or someone only came to them because of what they see the disability is? Because sometimes we don't want to assume that like one person can speak for all, but in which ways can we really ask of their services without making them feel that they have to answer for all those persons with that disability?
Ashanta, that's a great question, a very thoughtful question. So I have 2 suggestions related to that. First of all, the way you phrased it was to assist the organization, and I might broaden out to say like co-design. So the key thing is, rather than saying like, we want you to give us some feedback on what we've done, you, we, othering, right? So instead, I'd say that we want to do co-design, right? Where we want to have diverse voices. And it shouldn't just be one person with a disability. You want to have multiple people involved, and you want to have people who have a say in the development process. We call it often co-design or participatory design, but the idea is it's not you're being brought in at the last minute. Like, is this okay? Did we do this right? We, they, you, othering, you want to be careful of that. So participatory or co-design would be better approaches where you get a diverse set of voices in the development process. And the key thing is you can put out there and say like, we are redesigning our website, right? We want to make sure that it is fully inclusive to multiple populations. We invite people to join the committee, right? And that's a way, rather than asking someone specifically, that's a way of putting out there. And obviously you have to put that out in an accessible format, because if you don't put it in accessible format, you're not going to get diverse voices in there. I think if you look at what a number of community groups and nonprofit organizations have done, is that they have, if they have a large employee base, they have an ongoing set of employees with disabilities, not 1 or 2, but like a large panel, right? But if you're worried about, let's say you're in a community where you only have one person with a disability that you know of, you probably have more, right? But if, let's say there's only one with an obvious disability, maybe what you could do instead is reach out to local disability rights groups. If you feel you don't want to kind of put something on that individual or pressure them, you could reach out to local disability rights groups and say, we want to learn how to be more inclusive. We don't know if we have many people with disabilities in our community. This isn't something we've done in the past, and we realize the error of our ways. That might be a way to avoid putting pressure on that person, depending on your community. So I always believe in connecting. Disability rights groups are always eager to help with anything, right? That comes up where you say, we know we haven't done a great job, we want to learn more. Let me just put out there that often people are afraid of a lawsuit for accessibility. Disability rights groups generally want to partner with you. When you see these news stories about, 1,000 people sued or something like that, those are not usually disability rights groups. That's a whole separate set of legal issues. The disability rights groups really deeply want to partner with community groups to make the world more inclusive. I always say, go to those groups, right? And say, we need help. We want to learn more. How can we be more inclusive? Disability rights groups are the most underutilized and underappreciated resource, I think, in this realm. And they can point you, they may say, we can't do this, but we can point you to other people, or here's some people in your community who are eager, in your broader community, who are eager to help. But I'm a big believer when students of mine come up with ideas, and other students, well, I think we should do this for blind people. I'm like, have you asked any blind people this? No, right? Have you interacted with any blind people? No, right? But I think blind people need. I'm like, stop. go over to the National Federation of the Blind, right? Go meet with people. We're located near their headquarters. There are other groups, obviously, in your neck of the woods. But involve, ask, co-design, respect, right? You can easily, and I'm sure certainly that Kelsey could give us another 30 minutes talking about the similarities between, right, how people with disabilities are often left out of the discussion and how other, right, historically oppressed populations are left out of the discussion, whether that's indigenous populations, or, I mean, you could probably do a 30, I'm sure it'd be an engaging and interesting 30 minutes about that, but we don't have 30 more minutes.
Thank you so much for your expertise, Jonathan. Thanks.
Sure, my pleasure. This is fun.
We are unfortunately out of time. However, if friends have any questions, you can send it to the staff and we can figure out if we can get Kelsey and Jonathan to answer them and put them up somewhere. We'll figure that out. If you have any burning questions, just send it to us. But for now, we are at our time, friends, and I want everybody to go. It's been a long day. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Kelsey. Those were
Thank you, guys.
wonderful, wonderful talks.